10 levels of either being or becoming a Warframe player. Most of these are stages where it's taking the previous level into consideration, and really only one of these stages is what I would consider a sub-level of being a player. That will make sense when we get to it. Level number 1. Could this even be considered a Warframe player? But we're going to include it regardless. The probability of this player quitting the game is 100%. They have between 30 minutes to an hour of playtime. They didn't like the game, and they either quit mid or after the early tutorial. Simply put, this is just someone who tries out Warframe and didn't really click with the gameplay or anything that was presented, and thus quits instantly. There might be an argument in here that this isn't even a tier, but it has to be addressed. The second level is the subgenre of that. The probability of this player quitting is around 90%, and this is basically the friend who has been convinced by you to play the game. You're trying to get your mates into Warframe, one of your boys has hopped on and you're trying to teach them it, and they just don't end up enjoying it. And another few factors as well. They'll probably only get a few hours deep, and not only does you actually carrying them through the game make it boring for them, but you're trying to teach them everything and all that information becomes overwhelming. Thus, they don't fully get into the game. Level 3. The probability of this player quitting is around 80%, but they might return and give it a second chance. This is the player that survives past the tutorials, so even past the moment where the game just sort of leaves you to go and explore for yourself, which by the way is often a pivotal moment in which people do quit, but that could be applied to the previous category. This is the player that enjoys the gameplay and what they've been presented with so far, and where they do catch the tips in the UI, they'll continue to work their way through the star chart and maybe even dabble in some of the early quests. There's a really high chance they'll either get bored or confused because of the amount of information they have to consume. And the big kicker here is this player most likely quits around the time they realize just how slow crafting Warframes and weapons is. Stage 4. Probability of quitting, 75%. Despite the time gating on new items, this player has actually become invested enough and enjoys the game to an extent so they go out and farm their first new Warframe. I often picture this as a baby rhino, him being one of the most common first new Warframes you get. There's also a chance of them getting a bit more involved with stuff like the Plains of Eidolon, Deimos, Fortuna, Deviri, all of the open worlds, and they might even dabble in stuff like Natar and the Second Dream in terms of quests. Of course, these values vary per player, but the story or having a new character will often be a determining factor if this player continues or quits due to the grind. And this next point could be placed at any given category depending on the player, but I imagine around this stage, this person will have dabbled in some fashion frame or at least randomized some color palettes, which is of course the start of the fashion frame addiction. Level 5. The probability of quitting around the stage is at 60%. This player is starting their addiction and hopping on a few times a week. Not only still working on their star chart and quests, but also either learning through in-game tips or going out of their way to use the wiki and YouTube to speed up their progression. I'm fully aware some players go in completely blind, but I think it's more common for a game as overwhelming in terms of information like Warframe, players go out and seek information themselves, simply due to time constraints. By this point as well, they've probably acquired multiple new weapons and Warframes, but they still have an average understanding of how modding works. Like you're still probably going to have newbie builds around this time. But an important canon event that obviously is going to take place relatively early to mid-game, I'd hope for most players, that could have been either this or the previous category, but I'm going to place it here, is a player discovering the importance of evoking catalysts and reactors. This is only something you'll instantly know if an experienced player has told you or you've seen a video on it. Don't let the perception of people streaming the game for the first time and having a new player playthrough whilst they're getting backseated by their chats be a realistic depiction of what every player that hops on for the first time is going through. It's very easy within your first few weeks to months of the game to not realize that there's more modding capacity than that of just an aura mod. Level 6. This player has a 50% chance of quitting, but will more than likely just needs a break and they'll eventually return. At this point, they've fully fallen in love with the addiction and the grind of the game. They might have even spent a little bit of money on either a Steam, Tenogen skin, or even got impatient with making small amounts of platinum and just decided to buy some platinum with their money. They put some time into most of their open worlds, and very common is players will develop a bit of an identity or a frame that they quote unquote main out of the ones that they own at the minute. It's still working through their important quests, and they maybe have even used their first former, but they've been turned off at the idea of ever using a former ever again because of the way it resets the level of your Warframe, and they don't know how to speed level their frames yet. Once again, varies depending on how in the know this player is and how much they're researching. Also, a very high chance that by this point you've become aware of the helmet system, because it is something that is teased in a previous quest from early game, but they won't have it yet. The thing about this level that's the most important to note is this is borderline the peak in terms of how much they are enveloped in the grind of the game, where you're playing it daily and super invested. There's a high chance that this player burns themselves out and then has to take a break because they get bored. They're doing one thing after another. Level 7. This player has a 30% chance of quitting, but is guaranteed to come back after being burnt out. By this point, the player has most likely caught up on their mastery ranks if they'd been forgotten up until this point. Mastery ranks is something that's very easy to go forgotten, but I do think if you're someone that has not been doing them up until a certain point, eventually you'll just do them all in one over the span of a few days. At this point, they're trying all sorts of weapons, most likely getting their hands on their first Lich and Incarnon weapons. They've got a better understanding of modding, and they feel the reward in investing time into a Warframe or weapon. They've probably also become more accustomed to the grind and have actual efficient locations for farming stuff like XP and leveling their items, or also stuff like focus farming as well. I also really do think by this stage they've been making their own platinum through trades. Most likely stuff like prime sets, but I don't think they're going to be going ham with selling huge arcane sets by this point, and that's because they completed their star chart and they're working on their still path, gradually expanding their builds and becoming strong enough to actually conquer it. This by proxy means they're equipping arcanes that you get from the acolytes, and due to the want to invest in a Warframe or a main, there's also a very high chance that helmet has actually been unlocked by this point, as well as actually having a main focus school that they've invested their points into. Level 8. This player has a 10% chance of quitting, but they'll take breaks when they're bored. This player is tackling as many of the game's primary areas and expansions as possible. They're actively engaged with the story, and they're relatively caught up, which means they can keep up to date with teased content like in the dev streams, even if they're a little bit behind. They can make decent amounts of platinum, and they're also looking to try the next new Warframe or Prime when they come out. By this point, they've 100% realized the impact of focus on gameplay and caught up with every focus expansion you could think of, except for the excessively farm stuff like Tower on Strikes. They've used the helmet on multiple occasions, and they can actually do well in Still Path by this point as well. But you can't really consider them a veteran player based on their hours at this point, which often means around this stage, you're still going to be needing to farm up resources because you're not going to have a huge backlog of this stuff. And for reference, I'll consider this player to maybe be getting their hands on their first few Archon shards, and I'm talking about acquiring them from like EDA, ECA, or Netra cells, and Archon hunts. Level 9. This player won't quit, but they will take long breaks that are spaced out. By this point, the player's invested enough time to be quite comfortable on many of their resources when they hop on. They've played and invested into roughly 95% of the game's content outside of a few less important or niche game modes. They hop on consistently to do weeklies and stack helmet resources. They check out the vendors for weekly rotations and farm up their shards. This player has a pretty damn good understanding of how to build, and potentially a selection of frames and weapons they have as their main loadout. But let it be known, not every player has a main. They'll also be there for the new content when it drops and be farming it. This player is also capable of dabbling in the stuff like arcane farming to sell for platinum and stuff like Void Cascade, and that kind of factor will carry on into the 10th and final level. And now for level 10, the final stage of being a Warframe player. This is someone who will hop on the game for years to come, but they've developed a certain pace that prevents them from burning out, so they are consistently inconsistent. They're what one could consider a veteran player based on their hours and experience. They've been playing for so long that they have an abundance of backed up resources, likely make ridiculous amounts of platinum through any method available, especially Riven mods by the way. I think a good sign of someone who has ridiculous amounts of hours in Warframe is how many god rolls they have on Rivens and how much platinum they're making from those god rolls. People just have the time on their hands to sell these, and the players with that time have also invested said time. They'll mostly hop on for weeklies, but outside of that, maybe they'll test a new build or setup for fun. But because they've tried basically everything, they spend a disgusting amount of time either fashion framing or testing builds and stuff in the simulacrum. They'll always be there for an update drop just to instantly purchase the new stuff, because farming platinum has become quicker to this player than farming the new Warframe in the new mission. And if this player does ever quit, they will just return years later to enjoy everything they've missed out on. And once again, the addiction will reset. So those are the 10 levels I came up with. When I'm trying to do it like this, where it's gradually increasing in hours and experience and escalating in levels, that's different to if I were to do one where it's talking about subgenres of players, right? So for example, there's a type of Warframe player that's not what I would consider a level that everyone gets to, a mastery rank grinder. This is a type of player that purely spam collects every item in the game. I'm talking every weapon and every Warframe, purely for their mastery rank. They don't actually know how to build anything. Their hours are exponentially low compared to the amount of stuff they have in the game. Basically just level grinders that are actually noobs in disguise. That is a subgenre of player that I have ran into on multiple occasions. Is there anything wrong with that? Of course not. I just don't consider that to be a linear experience for people that keep playing the game. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. Everyone's experience will be different playing Warframe as you keep going. Not everyone is going to have done something or unlocked something by a certain point in their playthrough. Obviously, there's certain things that are locked behind mastery ranks, but your hours put into the game don't determine your mastery rank, because some people will crack on with it and other people just forget about them. Some people might even start fashion framing from day one. A lot of rules that I use to make this were not only derived from my personal experience, but my friends' experience, other YouTubers' first-time playthroughs, and how I imagine other players would be tackling the game if they weren't getting backseat gamed by YouTube comments or Twitch chats, because that's not realistic. And also, I've been watching Mr. Waffles, legendary zombies content creator. He's been doing his first-time playthrough of Warframe, and he's been going in completely blind and preventing anyone from backseat gaming him. And that's really helped me get an understanding of what this game is like for someone who doesn't want to go to YouTube or the wiki to figure out how the game works. He is just reading everything and figuring it out for himself. And I think that's been really useful in making it realistic what it's like for quite a decent amount of players that have that approach to the game. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you did, and if not, no worries. And I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.